The men took turns in holding Lali down, pinned her young body like a broken branch snapped from a tree. First one voice grunted, then others shouted, filling the stifling barn air with animal ferocity. Straw scraped and scratched the welts on Lali's naked back as she spiraled further into creeping oblivion of the men who surrounded her. She had implored God to help her die. He had remained invisible, ignored her supplications, allowing her body to be torn and tortured until her blackened eyes were parched of tears, her soiled mouth dry as parchment, and her whole being hung in shreds. The faces of Caucasian mercenaries, their Abkhaz and the Russian mercenary acolytes, filed past Lali's eyes, some with beards, others with tattooed arms and hands. One brutal man was missing 2 teeth and possessed a jagged scar that zigzagged down one collarbone. His crooked smile belied the viciousness with which he landed repeated punches on her body and face as his fleshy disfigurement approached and receded from her eyes. "Castrate you all," her cracked throat whispered. Lali allowed her body to go limp, deadening it to the renewed onslaught. The blows and repeated intimate violations no longer touched her mind as she drifted towards what she decided would be her death. "I am a shell. This sack of skin and bones have no meaning. I refuse a life of being shunned as a defiled and undesirable woman." She willed herself to a place where brain was disconnected from masculine hands and the animal stench emanating from both barn and assailants. She was swept into that other world where mind and body become disjointed from each other, where the soul hangs suspended between the two on a fragile silver strand. Cavern of black unconsciousness claimed her as the men turned their attentions to the grandmother. For the past 4 days, she had watched her chained granddaughter raped and brutalized. The old woman died within a few hours, begging Lali's forgiveness between agonizing screams. Then the men were gone, as quickly as they had arrived, like a swarm of greedy locusts ravaging one part of the land before savaging the next. Lali's delirium urged her to let go, to die, to end the shame of violation of her body and innermost being. Her skin twitched involuntarily at each scrape of the straw as she continued to feel the invisible weight of their bodies, as the stink of their unwashed crotches clung to her senses, along with the breath imbued with alcohol and wine stolen from the villagers' reserves. Her thread of life refused to snap as she lay prostrate, slipping in and out of consciousness. Nothing else disturbed the silence in the cow barn apart from the sound of flies, attracted to where her grandmother lay bloated in the late autumn heat, a rictus of fear embedded in her cloudy eyes. Milk eyes of the dead, of a soul now departed in a cloak of broken pride and suffering. Lali's own swollen eyes didn't allow her to see, but the odour of cadaver curled a stinking path and burrowed death into her senses as she lay in the soiled hay. She was barely aware of the buzzing insect's increased flicker of wings on her face, until the chain biting into her ankle dragged her back unwilling to physical existence. 7 days of their iron clasp had left red rust stains on the split skin and the open wound. She involuntarily shifted her foot and heard the dull chink. So God hadn't wanted her to die, had rejoiced as he watched her suffer, or had simply ignored her request. A spark of rage filled Lali at what she perceived as divine abandonment, as she felt the stirring of renewed life in her broken body. The young girl shakily propped herself up on one elbow and attempted to look through the haze swilling across her swollen eyeballs. Desperate thirst and the survival reflex urged Lali to remove the heavy metal looped tightly around her ankle. She rolled over onto all fours and clutched at a stable partition to pull herself to her feet. Her slight body screamed at each movement, but ignoring the pain, she pulled a horse blanket over herself and limped warily to the barn entrance. She peered outside, the sunlight jabbing needles into her dark eyes, and listened. A dog barked in the distance. She flinched at the solitary sound and instinctively retreated into the semi-obscurity of the barn. No birds sang, no sign of farm animals either. No familiar sounds of humans going about their daily business, but a stench so overpowering that Lali jerked away from the fetid air and doubled up as her stomach emptied of bile. Legs shaking, she teetered her way to her grandparents' house, trying not to notice the mutilated cadavers, human and alike, witness to wanton savagery and strewn around the village. After taking several minutes to climb the wooden steps to the veranda, she crossed the threshold of what had once been a warm family home spanning generations. It was ransacked beyond recognition. Someone had taken an axe to the carved wall panelling in a frenzy of wanton destruction. Her grandfather lay rotting on the wooden floorboards, darkened by exsanguination. Lali stared, her innermost emotions transfixed, changed into stone, as if laying her sight on the Gorgon's writhing snake hair. She sidled past his hacked remains and into the kitchen. If she were to survive, food and water were vital. Smashed preserve jars and wine bottles filled the sink. Lali cleared a space and actioned the hand pump. Blood running from the cuts made by the shards went unnoticed. Head bent under the flow of mountain spring water, she gulped greedily until her breath was lost as the water rushed into her lungs and her hand fell still on the pump lever. She surfaced, spluttering, uncertain as to whether she had just made an unconscious attempt to drown herself. The mercenaries and Russian soldiers had either taken or wantonly defiled the food reserves, and the late autumn heat had finished off anything worth eating, with hordes of large black flies hovering over each tiny scrap. The oven. Lali remembered her grandmother had just baked some cheese bread for breakfast when the men had arrived. Forcing her swollen fingers to grip the cast iron handle, Lali turned it and yanked the small door open. The once soft and plump cheese breads were now stale, but not tough enough to deter Lali. She set about tearing the doughy substance with relish, despite her sore mouth and aching jaw. Once finished, she found some clean towels, her grandfather's work clothes, and made her way to behind the house, where spring water from the glaciers above had been deviated into the outdoors family washing area. Lali dropped the horse blanket and emptied jug after jug of the freezing water over her head, lathering each microscopic area of soiled body. Pain didn't deter her as she scrubbed frenetically with a soft horse brush, making her wounds bleed, raising bruises into blacker mounds, desperate to cleanse the shame and humiliation. A raped girl would be shunned. Marriage would elude her and would bring social ostracism. Being part of the Soviet Union for 70 years had not changed Georgia's traditional Caucasus mentality, despite women's respected social status. Lali decided it was not an option to divulge her ordeal, and felt the bitter taste of disappointed dreams as she understood her place in society would be changed forever. A primordial hunger to survive flooded through her, as did the acerbic taste of revenge. Her resolve hardened like the glacial ice high in the mountains above her, and she decided she would live, take the refugee route through the Caucasus Mountains to the central Georgian capital of Tbilisi to find her father, mother, and baby brother. She would never find the monsters who perpetrated these crimes, driven by a crumbling Soviet empire desirous for revenge. But Lali knew she would seek them out all her life, as her subconscious searched men's faces for signs of recognition. She returned indoors, made her way to a corner of the main room and knelt, peering at the wooden floor. Her grandfather's cache beneath the floorboards appeared intact and undiscovered by the marauders. She prized it open. Her hand went deep inside and grasped the small leather pouch of rubles and gold coins she knew would be there. Then she felt it. The khansi, a drinking horn almost 2 foot long, decorated with chiseled silver, one of a pair that used to hang over the open fireplace, a treasured family heirloom from her grandfather that went back 5 generations. Lali's name was inscribed delicately into the silver surround, Kokava. It was carved with ancient drinking and religious symbols, and also displayed a delicate depiction of this very family home that had stood for generations in the once peaceful mountain village. Her grandfather had managed to save one of the pair, along with another priceless object, the 200-year-old necklace of chased gold and silver with large river pearls and garnets. He had known Lali would survive. Her hand trembled as she caressed the pearls and remembered how, as a child, she had pestered her grandfather to try it on. He had said, one day it will be yours." Her eyes took in the scene of his disgraced body as she fought back the first flow of tears. Her grandfather and grandmother were not buried in the cemetery as she would have wished, but Lali was satisfied no carrion would touch them after covering them both with soiled straw and raw animal pelts to mask the odour. There was no priest to sing the elaborate last rites prayers. Those she had been taught as a child hung unuttered on her swollen tongue. "There is no God in this place," was a constant thought. "Only the strong survive. I alone must make this journey, abandoned by those I trusted and obeyed." Images of the family's flight from Sukhumi on the Black Sea, crushed under Russian bombs, and the ensuing massacres haunted her, as did her mother's screams intermingled with pleas. She felt they would remain engraved in her memory. "You're the only one who can make the trip. I have the baby to carry and look after. Your father must carry our belongings, and you are neither tall nor strong enough to take his place." Her hysterical mother made it clear to Lali that had ignored her father's fears about the atrocities committed by mercenaries and the rumours of marauding mountain bandits. So Lali had dutifully broken away from her parents and baby brother and travelled to her grandparents' mountain village further into the danger zone in an effort to convince them to leave. But her maternal grandmother had remained stubborn. "The Russians and our other Caucasus neighbours won't do anything to us. It doesn't matter if the Soviet Union has fallen. We have always been friends. The tales you hear are made up, Lali." This stubbornness to admit the truth opened the gates to the unimaginable as the mercenary horde descended on the village the next morning. Lali remembered. Yes, how could she ever forget the words of her mother and grandmother? Obedience, duty, trust, God? What did they matter now, when Soviets and mercenaries had destroyed those values? Tears warmed her cheeks, but Lali stood immobile and silent as the sun descended behind the mountains. A sudden blast of cold air blowing through the damaged walls aroused Lali from her catatonic state, frozen amidst the destruction wreaked on her grandparents' family home. Night had fallen, and she began to begin this perilous journey to safety, flee from this place of death. Scavenging as many food scraps as she could, she bundled them with the horn into a warm blanket under her grandfather's nabadi, the ankle-length fleece cape he wore when tending flocks in winter. Several layers of woolen socks and straw packing filled the gaps in her grandfather's hiking boots, making them warm and reasonably comfortable, despite the enormous disparity in sizes. She put the necklace around her neck with shaking hands and tucked it out of sight in the clothing, felt the cool metal warm against her skin and the soft rub of pearls like a balm on her flesh. Margarita, that's what they called them. Pearls formed in mineral-rich waters were supposed to have healing properties. But would she heal? The young girl wondered. Lali hobbled along the path away from the village towards the higher mountains, eyeing the white peaks on the horizon, now covered in ominously black clouds of an early winter. She had neglected to bandage the rusty wound on her ankle, but by now had transcended physical pain. Her hand clutched at the clothing where the necklace lay against her flesh, and she abruptly stopped, transfixed by overwhelming emotions. The world was in chaos, and her life had ended under the Russian onslaught, supposed friends of Georgia, who now represented betrayal and treachery. Lali collapsed unconscious outside the church on the edge of the village. Dusk was casting its shadow as the first snowflakes fluttered around her inert body. Her ordeal clung to her like a grafted second skin, a carapace that kept all else out. Just like the heavy snowflakes falling on eyelashes, it blurred her vision, forcing eyes shut, scaled the view to the exterior. Maybe sometime in the future her soul would wander under a rock, snake-like, rub itself against a rough stone, and shed itself of the scaly and unwanted cover. The scars gouged deep as the snow, which was now her bed, burned her exposed skin as hot as cold, yet her whole body shook. She saw cadavers lying crow-black in the surrounding snow, felt the presence of others and the faint shuffle of refugees struggling against white drifts. Bandits, she tried to call, bandits. But her blue lips remained stubbornly closed as she saw in her feverish mind refugees stripped bare of belongings in the mountains on the Georgian border. She felt hands pulling away at the nabadi and the necklace removed roughly from her burning skin. Her family past was being stolen and ripped away. Lali gripped her grandfather's khansi tightly against her body and implored through her fever, begged, saying that every family possessed sacred drinking horns to respect elders, to lord life given by wine and food, and to drink with neighbours and friends. Their hands showed mercy and left her alone. Lali lay prostrate in the freezing snow and realised her ankle wound was so badly infected by the rusty chain that death called her once again. She waited for the welcomed godless void to descend. There you go.